Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Foreign Policy's publisher and CEO, Andrew Solinger.
Now we're on. Can you hear me? I know a lot of you are still eating, so that's why you didn't applaud. It is Unga Thursday, lunchtime. It's been quite a ride if you've experienced Unga as we have here at FP. We've had a week's worth of programming here on some incredibly important issues, but today in particular, we're very happy this afternoon to be talking about the power of purpose, mission-driven development in action. And as we know, the development system generally is under duress right now. And in fact, we just published an issue at Foreign Policy. We still do print magazines. We're primarily a digital media organization. Any publisher would say that. But this issue, this quarterly issue focused on the topic at hand is called The End of Development. And that's the title of a lead essay that economic historian Adam Tooze and columnist for FP Adam Tooze and host of Ones and Twos podcast with FP has written a piece about. And you will find this magazine in the tote bags that are on the back of your chair. So you each have one right now. So it's an incredibly timely conversation. We have all sorts of essays about the debt crisis, which I think is something we're going to dig into today. So please do read it. And I just wanted to express how important this conversation is to FP. So thank you for making time to have this discussion with us. I just want to set the stage a little bit on what we'll be talking about. Global inequality is on the rise. Sovereign debt is reaching crisis levels at the same time, as discussed, in dozens of countries, even in the most developed Western nations. So traditional development models are under scrutiny. Multilateral institutions are facing pressure to deliver amidst political fragmentation and a waning in public trust. So what do we do about that? At a time when global funding is volatile, we need still humanitarian investment. The demand for that and the need for that is stronger than ever. It's not something we can do without. So mission-driven development, what we're going to talk about today, including faith-based development, is incredibly important. And we're really excited to plumb that topic today with faith-based and values-rooted actors. It's gaining renewed traction. It's really worth talking about. So we're convening policymakers, civil society leaders, philanthropic leaders to explore whether and how purpose-driven approaches can succeed where traditional development systems have failed. So I'm really excited to dig into that program with you. We have some very exciting speakers. But first, some more housekeeping. So you have the tote bag. Carry that around. We want that spotted around New York City. Thank you. There's also, either you're sitting on it or you picked it up, a QR code card. On one side is a QR code that will take you to the agenda for this meeting, trying to save paper. You'll also see bios for all of our excellent speakers. And on the other side, if you flip it over, you will find a QR code for a Foreign Policy subscription, a discounted $80, UNGA 80, get it, Foreign Policy subscription. I know many of you are already subscribers, but the way we grow and build Foreign Policy is through subscriptions. And you're here to experience lively discussions that we think will really stimulate and inform. But you can get those kind of discussions all year long if you subscribe to Foreign Policy Magazine. And if you do subscribe to Foreign Policy Magazine, you get this cool hat. Why is he wearing this hat? So if you can't see it, this hat says soft power on it. And soft power is a term that was coined in the pages of Foreign Policy Magazine exactly 35 years ago in September 1990 by the dearly departed Professor Joseph Nye. And Joseph Nye was plumbing the fact that post-Cold War, with this huge hegemonic competition pulled apart, military power was no longer the same as education and culture and aid and the impact it would have. And that he called soft power. He later wrote a book about it. Joseph Nye passed away this year, sadly. So we made these hats to honor him. And you can have one. If you're a current subscriber, see Corinne at the desk outside, and she will give you one. She'll check our system. And if you're not, buy a subscription, and you get a hat, as well as all that knowledge. So that's my sales pitch. We also have reporters on the ground here in New York that are writing our SITREP newsletter. It's a weekly national security newsletter that we have turned into a daily here during UNGA. catching all the scuttlebutt. They're fantastic, and you could sign up for that also in your bag and read that. But very importantly, I'd like to thank the partners for today's discussion. So today's event was made possible with the help of American Jewish World Service, Caritas Internationals, Catholic Relief Services, Global Donors Forum, IOM, the UN Migration Agency, and Open Society Foundation. So I'd like to give a big round of applause to them, because we would not be here today without their support. I'll be back with you a little bit later, but in the meantime, enjoy the program. Let's get started.
Please welcome to the stage IOM, the UN Migration Agency Director General, Amy Pope, for a conversation with FP's Senior Vice President of Research, Dr. Maisha Alam.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon to those of you who are in the room here with us, and also to our global audience. I'm really honored to have an opportunity to sit down with you, Amy. You are, of course, the Director General of IOM, the first woman to hold that position in the agency's history, and doing really important work against very strong headwinds. And so let's dive right in. I'd like to start our conversation today by asking you a little bit about how humanitarian values inform IOM's work, and what are the essential humanitarian principles that you are trying to uphold in this current time. Set the scene for our audience a little bit about your work.
That's great. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for having this conversation at this moment in time. It's the right moment to have it, and to kind of open up a discussion of what it means to serve migrants, to serve people who are displaced, to serve people, frankly, on often their very worst day that they are having at the moment in time. And so the primary humanitarian value is really to start with humanity. At this moment, we often hear migrants and displaced people, refugees, being referred to as something other, being referred to as something less than human. But we know, and we see it every single day, because IOM is serving people directly on the ground, that this principle of humanity is what really infects our work and what inspires us every day. So we do not see people in terms of what status they have, whether they have a home or don't have a home, whether they're in the state in which they were born, or the state in which they're transiting, or state in which they're living or working. We see people first and foremost as human beings. And because of that, we're looking at how do we engage with them as human beings. So sometimes it just means providing the most basic humanitarian support. They need shelter, they need protection, they need food. Sometimes, though, and often this is where we want to go, is looking at the person in the round, and how do we think about their future potential, what they can bring, what they offer, and actually how they're part of solving some of the challenges that we collectively face in the world today.
Yeah, thank you for that, and really setting the tone in terms of humanity being at the core. As I was listening to you speak, I was brought back to earlier in my career working in the camps on the Bangladesh-Myanmar border, where IOM is doing exactly this work, helping people have a legal identity, registering them, providing shelter, and making sure that they are safe. And one of the things that you spoke about was the fact that increasingly and all too often, migrants, regardless of where they're coming from and the circumstances that they are trying to escape, are dehumanized. And this is a fundamental challenge, of course. Tell us a little bit about what are some of the other challenges that are most pressing at the moment that people should understand in terms of trying to uphold that commitment to humanity and the challenges that you're facing in doing that.
The first challenge is, I'll start with the resource question, and I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way than maybe you would think, because certainly we all know the humanitarian sector has been hit hard by cuts in resources, and not just by the U.S. government, by many, many governments around the world, and governments who are looking, for example, to increase their defense spending and then say, well, but we don't have enough for our foreign assistance or humanitarian aid. But in the areas in which we work, we first see migrants or refugees first move internally They're leaving their city, they're leaving their community, they're leaving the area they've been farming. Then they move to the country next door or the country in the region. And it's really only when people cannot find safety, when they cannot find opportunity, that they then move onward. So given the prominence of the issue today, given the concern about people who are moving through irregular channels, moving through smuggling networks, moving through traffickers, focusing on how we stabilize communities, how we provide opportunities for people at home so that they are not pushed to seek opportunities elsewhere is actually at the heart of the solution. So we see this tension right now between what governments say they want in terms of migration management, but the decisions they're making in terms of how they finance that outcome. And that is one of the biggest challenges we need to overcome today.
Thanks for that. And you know, thinking about, as I was listening to you speak, another thing comes to mind, which is that in addition to everything that you've already said, there's a lot of misconceptions about migrants and migration in this time. And I'd like to ask you, you know, if you could do a little bit of myth busting for our audience, right? What are some of the most harmful and prevalent misconceptions that you'd like to correct the record on?
Well, the first is that most migrants are actually moving safely and legally with a job opportunity in response to a labor demand. Oftentimes, we call those migrants expats. We don't call them migrants. But nonetheless, they are migrants. Yeah. So the vast majority of people on the move are moving in order to fill a job need or because of a sanctioned program that a government has put in place. So that's number one. The second is that if we look at the demographics playing out across the world today, we actually will have a need for more migration into the future. Yeah. Third is we look at what is driving people to move in an irregular way. So those who are not, you know, getting the job offer and those who are moving because they're displaced, the number one driver today is not conflict. It's the impact of climate disaster. So people who are moving because of a drought, they're moving because of a storm, they're moving because of rising sea levels, and they can no longer safely live at home. So when you lay out what are the facts versus the myth, you actually start to see some solutions, including how do we anticipate those communities that are going to be at the greatest risk of displacement and engage with them much earlier before they're displaced in large numbers. And then how do we create safe legal systems for people to move to meet some of these job opportunities that might exist so that we're not enabling the smuggling networks that are now profiting off of some of the world's most vulnerable people?
Yeah. And the point about smuggling and trafficking is something that I know we'll have an opportunity to discuss a little bit later in today's program. But your point about understanding what are the risks that people are facing and targeting solutions to that is so important, and goes back to something you were talking about earlier too, which is if you de-risk, then people aren't going to be compelled to move, right? Or they can make different choices and not choices only from a place of desperation. I'd love to talk a little bit, and as a segue to our next segment, about partnerships and how IOM leverages partnerships, especially, for example, with non-traditional actors, whether that's the private sector, philanthropic organizations, technology providers, you know, you name it, to navigate some of the challenges that you're facing and deliver solutions in this current environment that you're operating in.
So the first is actually the traditional partnership, a non-government actor who contributes money to support the communities we serve. So whether it's a conflict in Ukraine or the situation in Gaza or the situation in Sudan, there are people who want to give a bit of money or support to provide some kind of humanitarian assistance. That's a traditional kind of partnership we see with many of the international organizations. The second is where we really leverage what the non-traditional partners do best. So partnering with a delivery company to take advantage of their supply chain knowledge, for example. And the third is really what I find the most exciting is partnering with the private sector in particular around skills training, around hiring, because we know actually one of the drivers of migration is the fact that there are these labor market gaps. And so actually leveraging that partnership. So we do, as for example, in Mexico with the 10 Foundation, we bring employers to the table. They agree that they're going to hire migrants and refugees. They don't do this just because they're nice people. They're filling an important market gap, and they're doing so in a way that can help more people.
Yeah. Yeah, and that in doing so, as you were alluding to, it's also looking to what are the challenges of the future, right? The demographic trends, the labor market gaps, the workforce development that's required. Well, Amy, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in our next segment.
Me too. Thanks.
Please welcome back IOM's Amy Pope, who is now joined by Global Donor Forum founder and convener, Dr. Tariq Chima, and Muslim Charity Director of Programs and Policy, Irfan Rajput, to continue the conversation with Dr. Alam.
Hello again, and I am delighted to have an opportunity to build upon the conversation that Amy and I were just having, and this time to zoom in a little bit about faith-based philanthropy, and in particular Islamic philanthropy, and the opportunities that that presents to address one of the most urgent challenges of our time, which is ending modern slavery. Diving right in, Amy, I'd love to actually start with you. You were alluding to this a little bit in our previous segment, the role of trafficking, people on the move, and the ways in which they are often preyed upon, right? There are tens of millions of people around the globe who find themselves in situations of modern slavery, whether that's forced labor, forced marriage, and other types. So tell us a little bit about how you are confronting the issue of modern slavery at IOM, and also, how you see working with faith-based philanthropy in terms of finding solutions.
So I actually started my career as a prosecutor of human trafficking cases. And it's where I saw directly how persons who are vulnerable, persons who don't have status, persons who are migrants are very easily exploited by nefarious groups. And watching that play out, whether it's in terms of young girls who are forced into servitude in the United States, which, by the way, still happens, or in countries around the world, it makes you realize how connected these concepts are of having safe, orderly, and regular migration, legal channels for people to move, and channels where people are exploited. We now serve trafficking victims all around the world. Actually, we like to say survivors all around the world, whether it's to help them get access to government services, whether to get them to be able to testify against their traffickers, whether to help them get back home safely to their family. For example, I just met with the president of Mozambique, who told me about 16 nationals from Mozambique who had been lured into a trafficking call center ring in Laos. They didn't even know where it was located in the world, but they saw a great job opportunity. They were desperate to find a new opportunity. And the next thing they know they're halfway around the world and being trafficked. The faith-based community is essential to unlocking the solutions to trafficking in a number of ways. First and foremost is that the faith-based community is often on the ground level, can identify where trafficking is happening, and can bring it to the attention of the authorities. The very first case I prosecuted involved a young girl who went to a Catholic church and sought help. So this partnership here with the faith community is important on so many levels because it reaches into the everyday person, helps to educate, because they provide support and services to those who've been trafficked, and because they can drive policy and advocacy at a national level and at a global level.
Thank you for that. And I loved how you emphasized the trust element, the communication element, and of course the philanthropic element as well. And so, Irfan, I'd love to bring you into the conversation next. Tell us a little bit about how Islamic philanthropy can accelerate the fight against modern slavery, and what makes the Islamic Philanthropy Fund model scalable?
First of all, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon all of you. So, now, just building on Amy, what she said, and she talked about, penetration in the communities, and also supporting the communities, the second point, and all it is done with the Islamic philanthropy, because we have large number of societies, businesses in Western countries and in Islamic countries who are willing, as a civil society organization, to support against the initiatives of anti-trafficking and slavery. What really lacks with us is, unfortunately, the technical expertise required for it. Whether it's the civil society organization, this is what I can speak on behalf of, but I'm sure there are many governments who require the technical expertise as well. So Islamic philanthropy plays an important role in generating the resources, in generating the required advocacy, especially when it comes to the business people, when it comes to the people with the money, and even general donors, what we call it. Now, in Islamic philanthropy, 2.5% of our total income and of our assets as a Muslim, we have to donate it. So it's among the 5 pillars of Islam. So if you do not donate it and you do not give it, you can't call yourself Muslim. So simple is that. Now, organizations like Muslim Charity and many faith-based organizations, we dwell on this zakat for 2.5%. Now, there are businesses who give their sadaqahs. So they simply give it because they want to have barakah and blessings in their businesses. So as a faith-based organizations, we can generate these resources which are required now more than ever. Because we have seen that the governments do not have money. Our traditional donors who used to support these initiatives, unfortunately, they are struggling in their own countries. That's why it's so important that Islamic philanthropists, the organization, the businesses, the governments, they invest into it. And the reason of investment is, I want to take you before Ibrahim alayhi salam. I will just stick to it. There is not a single religion in the world, all the Abrahamic religion plus non-Abrahamic religion, who actually allows slavery. It does not exist at all. So it's the right time to talk about it, and it's the right time to generate the resources. So Islamic philanthropy is very important.
Well, thank you for that. And a couple things you said stand out to me. The first is there's individual giving, right, at the household and individual level. But there's also an opportunity to mobilize businesses and organizations, and that can be done in tandem in order to generate resources. But as I was listening to you speak, and Amy earlier, the other thing that I think is really important to note about faith-based philanthropy is it's an opportunity to open up conversations about topics that may either live in the shadows, be considered taboo, or even irrelevant, right? People may not even understand its relevance. And so the destigmatizing of these topics and normalizing to say, hey, this is happening, we need to find solutions. And so with that, Tariq, I'd love to bring you into the conversation and specifically pick up on something that Amy alluded to earlier, which is a survivors-centered approach. Tell us a little bit about, how survivor-centered approaches can be prioritized within faith-based philanthropy, and how do you mobilize actors to support that work?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all. Muslims makes about 1/4 of the world population, and they give in a huge number. So that if I use a very safe estimate, it is about $500 billion that is given annually in various ways. About 15 years ago, our challenge was that Muslim giving was huge, generous, but not very institutionalized. Mm-hmm. And it was given in silos, so we noticed that its ROI is way lower than actually it can be. So that led to the formation of the Global Donors Forum, and we are the pioneer and the premier forum of the Muslim donors worldwide. And I would like to thank Amy and IOM for actually providing us an opportunity to partner, because one of the way we actually refine our giving, we make it more human-centered, is because we need institutions who have expertise. Mm-hmm. So it cannot be just given generously and randomly. We also need to have partners where we have adopt the approaches, keep an eye on the impact, make sure the money is not being wasted. Because Muslim giving, end of the day, is, especially if we talk about zakat, that is not my personal money. That is the trust that I have to give to the people with whom it belongs. Mm-hmm. So that's why you have to take an extra level of care. So bringing professionalism, working with the organization who have their boots on ground, who also have expertise like IOM, so that we make sure the money actually reach there. And this is for them not to be dependent upon it, but it actually helps transform their lives and bring them out of that state of dependency.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we talk about human trafficking and modern slavery, I personally don't think it's an exploitation. I believe it is exploitation of the exploited. Yeah. The people who are victims of crisis, migration, forced eviction, this or that. It is probably one of the most horrible human crime that I view, because you are already preying on the people who are already
most vulnerable.
Yeah. And when we talk about zakat from the, it sounds very highly regulated, something very exclusive that only, Muslims know how to use it. And actually, there is an inbuilt ethical imperative in zakat. And there are categories that are very well defined who to help, and actually people who are the victims of human trafficking or migration, they qualify for that. Mm-hmm. And as a donor network, our responsibility is that we link the donors with viable solutions. Yeah. And how we can connect them. And without that, it would be a massive giving, random giving, but really may not be the very human-centric.
And may not be having the impact that
exactly.
And that goes back to something that Irfan was touching on earlier, which is how important it is to make sure that monies, in whatever form they come, are being combined with technical expertise. And, IOM knows how to tackle these issues, is already tackling these issues. So I understand that there's an exciting announcement to be shared. And so before we close out this discussion, I'd love to open it up to both of you to share that announcement.
Thank you so much. First of all, it's a very good news for the people who are exploited, what you call it. Yeah. We are very happy to announce that we are joining and asking IOM to join us to establish a forum which will be called Faith Against Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. As a Muslim charity, we would love to host that forum as well. And we will try to generate as much as resources that is possible for us. And also, as Tariq said, that join you to get the help of your technicalities to eradicate, to minimize, and one day finish this exploitation of the exploited and the anti-human trafficking.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Well, we are very excited that we held a forum recently in Istanbul called Muslim Impact Forum, and we were grateful for IOM's high-level representation. And based on that interest, I think within less than 4 months, we now have a Muslim charity which are committing $1 million. We have a couple of other donors like HCI. We have Evergive, who are giving another $500,000. So I think this is the start, the first drop of the rain, starting from here. And the purpose is not just looking at the size of the portfolio. It has to be big, looking at the amount of the challenge that we are facing. But most important is that people can track that money, they can see it's making an impact. So it's not just in the numbers, but actually at the grassroots. So plus, I think we are setting a trend here whereby UN agencies, which are, I would say, very courageous and bold, to partner with Muslim Giving. And why I'm saying this, because in 2012, we held the first Zakat Summit at UN headquarters. And it took 1 month for me to basically go out, beg the agencies to please come and attend, to asking the member states to come and attend. Why? Because they didn't know about this giving. Today, we have several agencies that are working on this. And why we pick IOM, let's say, or we promote IOM partnership is because they track a person from point A to the point where they actually are feeling safe and settled. So we think that approach is very strategic, and we would like to build upon that and bring more partners in it. And I'm also very proud to see Mona, one of my fellow advisors of IOM. She's here. Thank you, Mona, for coming all the way from Saudi Arabia, and she's working also very hard.
Well, congratulations on this commitment, which of course is inspiring. And I love what you said about it's not just what we give now, it's how do we sustain that and inspire others to join this movement. So thank you to all of you for sharing your perspectives and for the work that you are doing to bring hopefully a lasting and effective solution.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maich. And we hope next year we will be joining FP to talk about the impact of all these resources.
Fantastic.
And it's not just a talk, but actually it's a walk.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you.
Now, please welcome to the stage UN Women Policy, Program, and Intergovernmental Support Division Director, Sarah Hendricks, and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Director of External Relations, Dominique Hyde.
Tonight before it's over, to say hello. Hi. Hi, everybody. Building on the conversations that we've had so far, I'm really excited to have this opportunity to discuss the humanitarian landscape and critical solutions with two key leaders from UNHCR and UN Women. Sarah and Dominique, thank you for joining us today. Sarah, I'd love to start with you. And, we've just been talking about migration. And, of course, UNHCR's mandate is distinct and complementary. And what I wanted to know from you is, in a world where conflicts are lasting longer and the humanitarian system is stretched, especially in this time of downturn of aid, what are some of the approaches that you think are needed to meet the complexity of the challenge and really best serve refugees?
Thank you so much, Maisha, and it's wonderful to be here. And UN Women, where I work, is, I think, really honored to partner always with UNHCR. And certainly within the context of the current significance of geopolitical crisis, and the escalation of what we see as our new world order, we see the criticality of a number of things. One is to ensure that refugee women in particular are lifted up in terms of their resilience and agency, that we shift our perspective of relief to one of resilience.
Yeah.
And that we look at local solutions as the leadership that needs to drive the way forward, including in the humanitarian reset. And we really believe that that it is women who are refugees in local communities who already are the conflict mediators. They already are the teachers. They already are the entrepreneurs. They are the peace builders. And so it is that leadership at local level that needs to move from the periphery into the center. And it needs to be resourced effectively as well.
Yeah. Dominique, please.
Thank you, Maisha. Nice to see everybody here today. You know, the situation around the world is just deteriorating, and we're seeing the number of refugees, of internally displaced people, that has doubled in the past decade, while the funding actually is back to what it was in 2015. And what you're seeing as well is that these conflicts that are forcing people to be on the move and fleeing their countries, their homes, are becoming more and more cruel, and the violence is becoming just unacceptable. And you're seeing discrimination on the rise. You're seeing refugees that are being stigmatized. And what we need, and so happy about the discussion today, we need more solidarity and we need more partnerships. You heard it from Sarah. These conflicts and the situation for refugees, for internally displaced people, are not going to be solved just with humanitarian aid. We need peace building, we need development actors stepping up, and we need that local organization, women-led organizations, taking that leadership role together. I heard some of the panel just before. You need faith-based organizations. I know we'll come to that. So I think for us at UNHCR, it's a whole of society approach. And without partnerships, we're not going to be able to solve this, especially with where we are at right now as UNHCR, with 1/3 less of our budget. But let's forget just the impact on my colleagues, the impact on refugees. I was in Uganda a few weeks back. 600 refugees arriving on a daily basis in the country. By the end of this year, we'll be at 2 million refugees in Uganda. It is heartbreaking, and it's not about UNHCR. It's about the entire community. It's about the impact on the World Food Programme, on UNICEF, on the INGOs, on the local women-led organization, and on the government.
Thank you for that. And I'd love to pick up on two things, something that you said and something that you said, and bring those two pieces together, which is the needs are enormous, partnerships are critical, and ensuring that the people who are on the move have the agency, whether that's women, men, girls, and boys, is also really critical. So talk a little bit about the kinds of partnerships that you think are working well and what you'd like to see in the future in order to meet these growing needs. Go ahead.
Sure. You know, when we look at the scale of the problems and the challenges of what has just been described in terms of just the massive population numbers that are on the move and arriving as new refugees into host countries, partnership is absolutely critical. And as I said before, it is partnerships that need to lead with faith-based organizations, with locally led organizations. The composition of that partnership needs to ensure that it is the leadership that drives the solutions. And there are reasons for this. Mostly because those partnerships deliver aid faster. They have trust already embedded in the community. They are able to drive sustainable solutions. And they are already connected with women and their families and other refugees who are in need. And so we really see that the backbone of the support structures needs to be one of partnerships. And as I said, it needs to be locally led and globally supported. The challenge, however, is that when we recently undertook a survey across the world of partners being impacted by funding cuts, specifically local organizations, It was 90% of local women's organizations working in the context of crisis that said, we are being impacted. Our operations are being impacted. And 50% of them, Maisha, said that they will likely need to shutter their doors within 6 months. This creates an existential crisis of pandemic proportions. What this means for local women's organizations on the ground is that the backbone of that infrastructure of trust, of resilience, of being present in the moment of crisis, in the moment of conflict, disintegrates. And that is insecure for the whole world as a result.
And to that last point, the ripple effects are not just on those organizations and those immediate communities, right? They spread across. And that's, I think, one of the things that's really important to underscore. Please come on in.
So, you know, when you think of the partners you need, just a reminder. So I don't know if I threw out the big number, but the big number is that there's 124 million people that are displaced.
Yeah.
But 60% of those people are internally displaced. They don't leave the borders. They're displaced within their own borders, and they are in the same situation, and sometimes worse than refugees. So you need that local community that's going to actually host the displaced. 67% of people who cross a border, so refugees, in the case of conflict, violence, or persecution, are crossing into countries that are middle income or lower income countries, so very poor countries. Again, in Uganda, where I was recently, this one village had 3,000 Ugandans living there and 15,000 refugees. I mean, do the math in so many other countries. So the first and foremost is that community, those 3,000 Ugandans, welcoming them and welcoming them with the very little resources that they have. That health center, which no longer had support from PEPFAR or from other sources for HIV/AIDS, the teenage pregnancies, 11-year-old girl pregnant because of a variety of different reasons, and that has no more resources. So there's no resources for the Ugandans. There's no resources for the refugees as well. So where I'm coming at is that the first thing you need, though, in these situations is inclusion. So you first need to ensure that the local government that is hosting, so whether it's that local municipality in the case of internally displaced or the local government when it's a refugee population, that they are actually including refugees in their health system, in their education system, in their financial systems, so that we can quickly pivot in partnership with these governments so that we can get access to livelihood opportunities. Yeah. A big partner for us is the World Bank. The World Bank has come in with massive amount, $5 billion of grants directly to countries hosting refugees. And if you ask for inclusion, there needs to be a quiproquo. So that money doesn't come to us, it goes directly to the governments, and there's more funding in terms of loans and grants. But I'd say that that's a partnership that we very much value because it's actually helping the governments that are, in this case, really bearing the burden, and that community that I spoke to.
The host, yeah. You talked about inclusion, and Sarah, I'd love to bring you into the conversation about this. UN Women Now, for many years, has worked very hard to not just remind the international community, but really do the hard work that women aren't just victims in conflict, right? Or when they are displaced and caught in situations that are frankly beyond their control, that they have agency, that their resilience really is critical to making sure that those communities continue even despite the odds. Tell us a little bit about how you're approaching societal resilience and especially ensuring that women's agency and their ability to participate in decision-making, shape their futures is upheld.
Yeah, thanks, Maisha. And absolutely. I think the big word I would use is intentionality. Women are already, as I said, leaders in their community, but we need to shift from relief to a resilience model, to supporting that to thrive. And that requires intentionality. Intentionality of policy, intentionality of program design, intentionality also of political choices and investment choices. And I'll give you an example. Very recently in Mozambique, in a very affected community with a high refugee population, women were already leading, but required additional resources to do so. And so it's the combination of program design that mattered. The combination of e-transfers or electronic direct cash transfers into their mobile money accounts, together with skills training, together with entrepreneurship support that enable women to not just be victims of that context, but actually be able to thrive in terms of livelihoods, in terms of protection, but also in terms of leadership. And it is that type of a comprehensive model that reinforces leadership, agency, and protection of women and girls that really is required in this time to ensure that we move away from a victim-centered model to a leadership, agency, and resilience-centered model.
That's great. And as I was listening to you speak, I appreciated the example that you shared about leveraging digital tools in order to reinforce the opportunities that exist. And I'd love to hear how UNHCR is also perhaps leveraging, whether it's emerging technologies or just making sure that digital connectivity can be part of the solutions and the opportunities that people on the move and who are displaced have.
So maybe just to take a step back and just echo what Sarah was saying. Even your question is good. Women cannot be always. We can't keep on talking about women as victims. They're entrepreneurs. They're peacemakers. They're active part of society. In the case of refugees, what we're seeing in Chad, where I was also recently, is over 60% of the women arriving from Sudan of the refugees arriving are women. And they're arriving and they were studying. So coming back to your digital question, they were studying in universities. I met this woman who had to flee. She fled with 180 other members of her group after her whole family was killed. When I met her after her 10-hour journey to Chad, the entire group was either killed or the women were all raped. By the time they reached Chad and reached safety, only 10 were left. And when I met this woman, and it was just a few days after these horrific acts had happened, she said to me, I've gone to university. I want to continue. I have no more family. What can you do to help me continue my education? And this is where digital comes in. And this is where the power of your phone and bringing private companies. So we're partnering with a private company in Chad to bring that digital support to the community, bringing solar panels, because of course there's no energy either. So it's all connected so that she can continue her education and hopefully continue to contribute to her community and to the society.
It's such a moving example, and I appreciate you sharing it because it speaks to what we were talking about earlier. Like, this horrible thing happened to her, but her resilience and her desire to have a life beyond that, and how do we support it? If for the audience and for both of you as well, if you caught the previous segment, I had asked a question to our esteemed panelist earlier about kind of in this time when misinformation is unfortunately so pervasive, let's do a little bit of myth busting. And so when it comes to UNHCR's work, when it comes to UN Women's work, if you could correct the record and help people understand just one or two things, that these are the things that, for people to know and to bust some myths, what would it be? I'll go to you, Sarah, first, and then to Don.
It's a great question. I think right now we are collectively and increasingly aware of the world that we live in, marked by significant protracted conflict, by climate crisis, but also especially by democratic erosion and by the massive shrinking of civic space.
Yeah.
And within that, there is an assumption that gender equality and women's rights will plod on in a consistent progression upwards. And that actually is a myth. And so I'm here to tell you that, unfortunately, that is not correct. What we are seeing around the world is actually quite concerning. Right now, our data tells us in a report that UN Women, together with UN DESA, bring out every year for the UN General Assembly, called the SDG Gender Snapshot Report, that by the year 2030, there will be 351 million women still living in the worst forms of poverty around the world. There will be 708 million women who get pushed out of productive work because of unpaid care work in the home. There will be, and are, 676 million women just last year who lived within 50 kilometers of conflict. These are significant, massive proportions of the status of women that is not going in an upward trajectory. And the causes of it are actually not inevitable. They are the reflection of political choices. They're the reflection of disinvestment. They're a reflection of institutional erosion. They also are the reflection of defunding of women's organizations on the ground. But I am here to say today very clearly that this does not have to be, that those same political choices that support disinvestment and civic erosion actually can choose otherwise. And that a different pathway can be possible. And we see that in the data too. We see that given political choice and determination, gender equality and women's rights can thrive. But it is not a given. At the same time, the future is not fixed. And so we want to ensure that women-led women's rights organizations do not fall prey to this moment of backsliding on gender equality, and that we are stepping up as a global community to ensure that they are resourced effectively. The Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund is something that exists across the whole UN system, is one example of driving resources right into the hands of women who are at the front lines of conflict and crisis, and one that we've seen be so effective in terms of stepping up and ensuring that the women most in need, that their needs, their priorities are met, and that their agency is lifted up.
Great.
That's a hard act to follow. I'm not even going to try.
Sorry, you got me very good.
No, I love it.
Well, I would say everything she said but I would say everything Sarah said, of course, also stands for refugee women. So I'd say, first of all, you know, the disinformation on refugees and migration, I mean, you know, you heard from IOM just before. I don't know if you asked that question, but and the discourse around refugees is just horrendous and cruel. And it has impact on a daily basis around the world on people's lives. And we're seeing this. And I said this statistic earlier, that 76% are hosted in middle and low-income countries. That's a big misperception that refugees are all coming to Europe. They're all coming to the US. They're all coming, I'm Canadian. They're all coming to Canada. It's a much smaller percentage than the ones that are hosted in their own countries. The other problem with the misinformation, disinformation that's happening specifically and is actually targeting refugees is through the social media. And they're getting access to this, populations are getting access to this, and it's creating more and more hate crimes towards refugee populations. There's no reason for that. And finally, refugees are contributors to society. We have statistics after statistics that I don't remember right now as you've just quoted them. But for Colombia, I remember specifically where actually the refugees that have arrived and migrants, because it's in the case of Venezuelans, it's a mixed population. When they've arrived in Colombia, they've actually helped the economy thrive and increase because of their level of education.
And that's been possible because they were given the environment in which to do it, with the rights, the protections, the legal identity, right? If you have conducive conditions, then you can actually see how much they can contribute to the societies in which they've arrived. So, well, Dominique and Sarah, thank you so much for this conversation and for taking the time to share your insights, to keep up the good fight, and for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Please welcome back to the stage FP's Andrew Solinger.
Hello, everyone. Exciting discussion so far, do you think? Very much looking forward to this next one. I'm here to make a special intro. We've got a great panel for you to talk about borrower leadership and systemic reform. That will include Professor Mariana Mazzucato. She's a professor of the University College of London, founding director of UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and author, Mission Economy. Dr. Dauda Sembene, CEO of Africatalyst, and Laura Carvalho, Global Director of Economic and Climate Prosperity at the Open Society Foundations. They will be joined and moderated by FP's own columnist, Adam Tooze. I mentioned to you earlier that Adam has authored the lead essay, The End of Development, in the magazine that's on your chairs. I'm sure it will pop up on the discussion that you're going to have right now. So please welcome them to the stage.
Hi, welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to be part of the foreign policy team during UNGA. And we have an extraordinarily urgent topic to discuss in the next 23 minutes and 50 seconds, I'm seeing on my calendar here, which we're going to take seriously because at least one of the panelists has a flight to catch. And the theme is debt. And I think from a historical point of view, if you're trying to locate the current moment, you might say that we're at a moment of decision, I think, in some ways. Because from the debt jubilee movement of the early 2000s over the subsequent 15-odd years, we lived through a period of debt accumulation, or you could say borrowing-funded growth in many parts of the world. It's easy to demonize debt. Debt was also the financing of genuine progress and development in many places. It was a model that diversified the sources of funding from the old Paris Club lending model to various types of grants, various types of market-based lending, and a whole bunch of new lenders, most notably, of course, China. And it's a model that I think we have to accept came crunchingly to a halt in the 2020s. First with the COVID shock, then with the war, Russia's assault on Ukraine, and the inflation shock that followed, which triggered the world's central banks into the largest uncoordinated tightening of monetary policy since the late 1970s, with an immediate freezing of international debt markets to the most exposed, what were called frontier market borrowers. The result has been a series of moments of debt crisis, 60-plus countries under acute debt stress, and a moment, I think, to reflect on where we're at with the debt model and whether we need to and how one might think about a debt structuring move for this decade that would open the space for new forms of development, more sustainable forms of development, and forms of development that don't feed logics of financialization. And this is a story both about immediate crisis, and it's about a story about long-term change. It's a story about power with a question of the role of the multilaterals, the role of major power lenders, and the role, as our title suggests, of borrowers also as actors in this scenario. And I thought I'd start with Dauda, who's in the front line of many of these conversations, sitting as you do in Senegal. How you responded to this title, debt of power. What is the idea of leverage? What possibilities of systemic reform do you see in the current moment?
Well, thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. Indeed, when you look at the global debt architecture, one powerful actor within the system is the borrower. The borrower.
The borrower.
Yeah, borrowing countries actually should be the most powerful in some sense, because the reality is if they don't repay their debt, of course there is a crisis in the sense that the creditors would be facing a lot of issues. But in reality, what we do see is actually the borrowers are the weakest actor in the system. And as you speak, I'm thinking about all of those 20-something African countries that are right now either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. And some of them who are in debt distress cannot really use the multilateral global debt system to get back on their feet. And so this is actually the paradox that we are facing. Those actors that needs to be the most powerful, unfortunately, ended up in the reality being actually the weakest one. And when they are facing issues, the global financial architecture is not very much able to address their issues and make them very much regain their foot. That's a big problem. So now if you ask me what needs to be done, first of all, the most immediate sort of priority is to solve those issues, because behind the debt crisis, we are talking about a human development crisis. Yeah. We are talking about actually countries that are unable to use the scarce resources to either invest in the health of their population or the education of their population, or even actually satisfy basic need in terms of infrastructure. So we need urgently to very much find a way to restructure the debt of those countries that are in debt distress. But most importantly, that should not be enough. That's what we did during the HIPIC crisis. We actually came up with debt relief, and then we stopped there. And then, of course, the crisis came back again. So you need to find what are the root causes of the debt crisis and address them. And to me, we can talk about it, of course. We need to address the flows in the global financial architecture. Right now, there is some cyclicality of capital flows that actually hurt African countries and developing countries in general. There are also problems with multilateral financial system, starting with the IMF, the World Bank, MDBs. We need to address all of those issues to avoid the recurrence of the debt crisis.
And just to sort of push on this issue, do you see any scenario at all in which debtors, either individually, singly, or as a coalition, might actually exert leverage? I mean, right now we have the extraordinary display of Argentina, having a kind of tailor-made partisan bailout, including mobilizing the Fed and the US Treasury. Assuming that's not our model, what ways might debtors exert leverage, do you think?
Well, I mean, collectively, debtors should actually organize themselves as we see it with creditors. There is the, Paris Club. There are other clubs of creditors that are actually acting to leverage and sort of their own interest. Debtors needs to do the same thing, and we're actually hearing growing calls for the, borrowers clubs, for instance. But most importantly, when you take, Africa, for instance, I think we do have sort of a need for the African Union to very much continue pushing for a way to coordinate the interests of the various countries and try to push for a common position and push it and but very much do it during the G20 and other global sort of economic debates to make sure that actually the interests and the voice of these countries are heard, because that's a big problem also. If countries are not heard, if their voice is not very much sort of heard, if they're not very well represented actually in international financial institutions or in those fora where they need to really talk and make their case, it's very difficult to address their issues.
That's a great opening. Mariana, one thinks of you as the great advocate, the great champion of industrial policy, of the big push, moonshot vision of economic development. How does the debt problem and the financial architecture that hangs together with it figure in your view of our contemporary predicament?
Right. So first of all, I think industrial strategy is growth strategy. I don't really see the difference. Growth is a function of public and private sector investment, and when you have a low investment economy, you have a low growth economy. And industrial strategy, when done right, is about catalyzing public and private sector investment across the economy. But I just wanted to bring it back because we're talking about debt as though it's just about public debt. But the financial crisis, we know, was caused by private debt. And in many countries, like where I live in the UK, the ratio of private debt to disposable income is actually back close to record levels of what it was just pre-financial crisis. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind, because every time a country then has a crisis, we might think it's helping companies or people to take out debt. In the UK, we have help to buy schemes. But if real wages aren't rising, you're just taking out more debt. And again, that ratio keeps rising. And that's a key weakness in the current kind of overly financialized capitalist system where a lot of the global finance actually goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate. And that, again, increases this debt cycle. But in terms of the public debt and how it relates to industrial strategy or growth strategy, is I think one of the underlying structural causes of the debt crisis is an investment crisis, which then austerity waves, call it what you want, but the fact that many loans by the IMF and the World Bank to the global south were and continue to be, even though they're saying it's not, but just look at the loans and you can actually see the conditions, were conditional on countries reducing their deficit to, frankly, just a random number, 3%. I don't know where that came out of. And we know that that's not the problem. The problem is, are you investing in all the long-term drivers of growth? Debt to GDP. Right? So if you're not investing, and again, it requires investment strategies, industrial strategies, and so on, to get that denominator going, then you might have what we had in Europe, which is, again, after the financial crisis, forgetting that it was caused by private debt. We blamed the public sector, massive wave of austerity, and to get any help, the so-called pigs, I'm Italian, so I'm allowed to say it, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Terrible Goldman Sachs word, by the way. It was their invention. Beautiful word, pigs. Anyway, they were forced to reduce their deficits. They were proud they did. Italy reduced the deficit, was even running a surplus, and yet debt to GDP rose. And it's basic math. X over 0 is infinity, right? So if you're not actually, again, investing in those long-run drivers, and it's not just helicopter money, that's why then you need an industrial strategy. I wrote this book called Mission Economy, just saying we would have never gone to the moon without the government actually leading, getting the private sector involved to solve all those different problems the astronauts had. How would they go to the bathroom? What would they wear? What would they eat? That should be a climate strategy, right? Like a green industrial strategy is, how do we build? How do we eat? How do we grow? How do we move? And that requires private investment. But the problem is, as long as loans are given out to the private sector, for example, even from public banks, which many developing countries have, that are not conditional on investment, and if we don't have additionality metrics that make sure that these public programs get investment to happen that otherwise would not happen, then we have what I call a parasitic public-private partnership, just lots of subsidies, loans, guarantees, and yet the private sector isn't kind of doing its bit. So I think a key bit here is both remembering that private debt is a big problem, that underinvestment in low-income countries, but also I just gave you the example of Europe and Southern Europe is a key driver of then low growth, which also has its own cycle. And then what does it mean to have an active industrial or growth strategy that can actually expand productive capacity in the economy and make it more resilient and not caught in this debt trap, and getting the IMF and the World Bank loans not to be conditional on austerity.
So two facets so far: a concerted, data-driven push to attack the architecture, a strategy for growing the denominator, which refuses the kind of financial blackmail that makes that impossible. But when we were talking ahead of time, you were saying domestic resource mobilization is a key story for you. And that has been an absolutely anchoring element of all the conversations about development finance. And as a historian, that comes naturally, right? Because it's clearly the fiscal state that ultimately has got to be an anchor here. How do you see the challenges of facing the domestic resource agenda in the current moment and their potential for breaking the impasse?
So, yeah, first of all, of course, a development strategy is key to also to the domestic resource mobilization. But yes, I do see a prospect that countries are seizing momentum on both the taxation agenda that has a cooperation agenda associated with this. It's not just pushing for progressive national tax reforms in countries. It's also making sure we close the loopholes, we fight tax evasion, and we cooperate with one another to set minimum taxation standards and the trickle-down economics that also eroded the tax base everywhere. So that's one piece. It's not the only piece. There's an increased role for national development banks and other domestic development finance institutions that are way more connected to national development goals and to those things that Mariana was mentioning will deliver on the sort of denominator of this problem. And that could be strengthened by an international system as well and by a different, much more coordinated system between multilateral and regional development banks and the national development banks or sovereign wealth funds or domestic finance institutions that can be giving loans in domestic currency as opposed to in dollar-denominated debt, which is a big part of this problem, right? It's the fact that countries are so vulnerable to changes in the global context because they're taking loans in dollars and they don't control the dollar, right? So that's a big piece. A second one that I would stress is the sort of how do you protect your economy of these pro-cyclical fiscal capital flows that Dauda was mentioning? And so, of course, the way countries are doing it is by accumulating international reserves in dollars. That's a big price to pay to be in this system. It's a costly thing to hold reserves out there with low interest rates, low returns, but it's essential. And as a Brazilian, it's what's allowing countries like Brazil to avoid the debt crisis that we had in the 80s, because we hold those reserves. But I think there are more coordinated ways that have to do with capital account regulation and other mechanisms to avoid that short-term capital carry trade, short-term speculative capital to come into the countries that are the first to go out when a crisis hits, and then adds up to the issue that you were mentioning at the beginning on interest rates here affecting and having a direct implications on interest rates everywhere else.
But we've got 9 minutes, and let's try and get to kind of the nub of this, because all of these ideas are great, but we all also know that these ideas have been around for some time, and many of us have been banging on the drum about this for some time. And we all know that as sensible as these ideas are, and as good as they are, and as clearly better as the world would be if we would only adopt them, they don't get adopted. They just, it hasn't happened. So I think we owe it to ourselves, surely, to get as clear-headed as we can be about what it is that stands in the way of an adventurous growth strategy that says, don't you understand, the only way through is through, right? The only way through is through. What stands in the way of powerful debtors saying, you need us, you don't lend to us for charity, like you lend to us for yield. You said you bought in on the risk-return bargain, well, here's the risk. Like, this is why you got your 9% yield, your huge spread over German bonds. Here's the moment. Like, same with resource mobilization. We know this story, right? So I guess I would love to hear from you, each individually, with regards to your great idea. Like, what you see as what is the chief obstacle? Like, why can't we move forward? I mean, Dauda, what do you see as the thing holding people back?
It's a very tricky question, Adam, but I'll tell you, actually, there are a number of issues that are actually standing in the way. One first issue is we always don't have, unfortunately, responsible borrowing and responsible lending. That's the first problem that we have. I'm talking here about the debt crisis that we are facing. We have seen countries that, of course, first of all, we need to recognize that no country can grow or can actually develop its economy without sort of borrow, or without debt. So this is something that is a must, but it must be done in a responsible manner. Unfortunately, what we have seen is in many countries that has not been the case. But when there is a problem with debt, we tend to think about the debtors only. We tend to forget about that there is on the other side a creditor that has not been maybe also sort of lending responsibly. So we need to make sure that both are held into account so that they do their job in a better way. So that's first problem. A second problem that we see, and I think that, that Laura and of course Mariana alluded to, many countries do have a very weak resilience to shocks. When you talked about the past decade, we have seen so many shocks, whether we are talking about the COVID shock, whether we are talking about the Ukraine war, whether we are talking about, the energy price shock, all of that. Unfortunately, some countries are not well prepared to handle them. And of course, when it comes, they tend to very much go and borrow, and it's actually aggravate their debt situation. Another problem that we face in Africa particularly, since the Libya crisis, there has been actually there has been a sort of security tension many countries have been facing. And they have been actually paying double-digit sort of fraction of their budget to very much respond to that security crisis. And that actually takes a toll on the public finances. That's an issue that many of them, unfortunately, cannot handle. But last but not least, We are talking about countries, and I'm here actually talking from the perspective of low-income countries. Many countries there do have, of course, weaknesses and sort of capacity weaknesses that actually stand in the way of them being able to implement actually some, policies that can sustainably promote growth, mobilize domestic revenue, as Laura was saying. And that's a big issue. But behind that, of course, we have to recognize that, debt crisis is a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility by the debtors and the creditors. And when we are able to resolve the debt crisis, it's not going to only benefit the borrowing countries. It's also going to benefit not only creditors, but the global community in general. Because then we are able to address a lot of global challenges that many countries are facing now, whether we are talking about migration, whether we are talking about climate, whether we are talking about, security, all of those issues, we cannot solve them without making sure that the debt crisis is addressed so that countries can use their limited fiscal space to spend it responsibly.
Mariana, what do you think stands in the way of your excellent plan?
Well,
what is the thing that is why does it not happen?
Yeah.
I mean, pick a case, but it's kind of fascinating to think about it.
I mean, the word ideology sounds like it's just too big, but actually we need to then say exactly what happened and why were these stupid things done for purely ideological reasons where there's so little evidence behind it. And let me just give you an example. We talk about this huge SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, gap, right? 7 trillion. That's huge. Are we going from the billions to the trillions, right? That slogan that is everywhere? No. The so-called blended finance schemes have only been generating about 15 billion a year. That's pennies in terms of that big pot. At the same time, 7 trillion is the amount that the large corporates, S&P 500, have spent in the last 10 years just on share buybacks, buying back shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. Why did that happen? If you go back into the history, and you're a historian, the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, was basically lobbied to make that level, that excessive level of lack of reinvestment into the economy legal. It used to be illegal. Okay, why did capital gains tax fall by 50% in 4 years at the end of the 1970s? There was huge lobbying, by the way, by the National Venture Capital Association in this country that made that happen. So there's both stories, there's ideology, there's legal changes. But, back to the positive story, which is, there are these ideas here. And as you say, many people have great ideas. How can we make sure that they actually happen and we stop doing what the teenagers say we're doing, which is blah, 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 right? Greta Thunberg said, stop blah, blahing about climate. We need to actually really point out these figures that I've just been talking about. Blended finance, it sounds great. It sounds like a yogurt or a smoothie, right? Well, it's not. There's very little proper private sector money getting crowded in. It's still going to the very large infrastructure projects and the so-called bankable sectors, much more to middle-income countries than low-income countries. And again, if you look at the contracts, and I'm increasingly interested in contracts, unfortunately, because it means I need to speak to lawyers to actually understand stuff, it really is socialization of risk and privatization of reward. So if you take, we actually wrote a whole paper about this called Mind the Mission, Not the Gap. Nice that mission is, a title here, which is it's not a financial gap. It's the shape of the finance. It's the shape of the contracts. There are good examples in both the global north and the global south where we've seen BNDES, for example, in Brazil, but also the KfW in Germany. They made all their loans conditional that the private sector actually, again, invests, for example, in green steel, which people might critique it, but, that money was conditional that they innovate towards an objective. So how do we take the SDGs instead of making fun of them? And I think you just wrote a great paper, I've heard, saying that, not making fun of it, but just saying that we haven't taken them seriously, transform them into really clear missions and goals, and make sure our industrial strategies, but also the tools, the contracts, the public bank loans, and everything I was saying before actually catalyze that investment towards mission accomplished. And there's good examples of that.
Thank you. Laura, we've got just a very brief few minutes before you have to head off to the airport. If domestic resource mobilization clearly is like the key here, it's also the ultimate chicken and egg problem, isn't it? In that you need domestic resource mobilization to build the growth that then in turn generates the... I mean, are there ways into that cycle of impossibility that open it up to actually expanding the realm of what works? as the experience in Brazil that is, for many people, an inspiring example of agency.
Yes, and I think, of course, there are many vicious cycles here that we need to break away from. One of them is the inequality, democracy problem, where for the domestic resource mobilization agenda, inequality actually harms the prospects of being able to approve tax reforms that make sense from a justice perspective, but then it also exacerbates the original issue here by deteriorating the perception of the public on what the state can do and what democracy can do for them. So I do think Brazil, not only by intentionally framing the tax reform agenda and the unfairness of its tax system as a national political agenda, but also understanding that this connects to a cooperation agenda, that no country, even though the right unit of analysis is at the national level, and the changes we're talking about here, most of them happen at the national level, they still need cooperation to be able to implement this idea. Because, of course, if one country does it and the other does not, then, wealth just flies somewhere else, right? And so I think that helps us conceive of a multilateralism that is way more connected to the national priorities and people's priorities, right? And that emerges from what the challenges are at the national level, as opposed to top-down solutions that we keep thinking about. And I'm not saying there are no reforms needed at the global level, but often we think that the first step is to correct the institutions globally, and that this will solve the problems. And I think we're starting to realize in this context, especially with the U.S. Being where it is, that we need to focus on the national agendas while understanding that there's no way around cooperation in a context like this, both for a defensive purpose and for a way forward.
And the money's actually at the national level. So take the development banks that Laura mentioned. There's only about 2.2 trillion in the multilateral development banks. There's 23 trillion in the national public banks. So getting the multilateral ones to have almost like a soft power, helping them steer than the national money. But that requires, as you say, a very different type of world from the one that we're hearing.
Well, thank you. What a very interesting place to end. Very short, but very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage UN Trade and Development Secretary General, Rebecca Greenspan, for a conversation with FP Executive Vice President, Alison Carlson.
Hello, everyone. That was a very interesting conversation indeed, and thrilled to be able to build upon it. Secretary General, thank you for being here with us today. I'd like to pick up on that theme of debt. In addition to being the Secretary General of UNCTAD, you're also a member of the high-level panel on financing for development. And last year, this may have been mentioned in the last discussion, but over $920 billion was spent on interest payments alone in developing countries. And so, having heard some of that previous conversation and thinking about the work you're doing and where you sit, how are you seeing this burden of debt really impacting countries' abilities to invest domestically, and how does that affect trade capacity in particular?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I think that it was a wonderful panel, so I won't repeat what they said because I agree with everything that was said. But let me just give you a number that I hope you take home, yes? Today, 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more in servicing the debt than on hospitals or schools, yes? Than on health or education. So that answers your question. If we spend more on the servicing the debt than on development, we have a crisis of development. And why? But the question is why. We know this, and we know that the problem is getting worse, not better. The number was 3.3 billion last year. Now it's 3.4 billion. And the number was 800 something billion on servicing the debt. Today is more than 900. So it's getting worse. And we know. So why nothing happens? And I have 3 answers to that.
Excellent.
My first answer is people are in crisis, but markets are not. And that's the main point. We call crisis only when markets are in crisis, not when people are in crisis. So that's why we call it not a debt crisis, but a development crisis. Nobody wants to talk about the debt crisis because countries are not defaulting. And why they are not defaulting? Because it's very expensive to default. Because we don't have the restructuring processes to really make it happen. We don't have a Chapter 11 for countries. We don't have an institution that really is a permanent. We are always taking ad hoc measures for debt restructuring. And despite the fact, and I think that is important to say, despite the fact that the G20 took the decision of having the debt framework, and that was a very good step forward, it stopped short of going farther in some of the conditions that will make the process possible. So it's perfect, yes, for the markets. You are not in crisis, and you won't be in crisis because governments will do whatever they can not to default. But in the meantime, so development suffers and people suffers.
How does that then translate into countries' ability to engage in those markets and international markets in particular? You know, certainly you're the Secretary General of the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Mm-hmm. And so in light of the global markets and what we've seen over not just the last few months of headlines of tariff barriers and trade wars and all of these things, but these structural issues that continue to impede countries' ability to access foreign markets, have foreign exchange implications. You know, how are you thinking about that, and what then needs to be done to start to restructure this system and think about it a little bit differently to break some of these cycles?
Yeah, it's a very important question. First of all, I think that we have to say most of the countries of the world needs trade and investment to grow. We cannot do it without trade. Try to develop without hard currency. Yes, and you know, I come from a small country. Most of our countries, small and medium sized, we are very open. We need trade to succeed, and we need investment to succeed. So the problem is when trade and investment doesn't happen for the world. Yes, and in trade, uncertainty right now is, as I say, the highest tariff possible. Yes, because uncertainty stalls investment. And so we need, I think that it's good that at the end we avoided a trade war, a tariff war, and there are negotiations. That's better than a tariff war like in the 30s. But the small countries and the vulnerable countries are suffering the most because they don't have the power to be the first to negotiate. And so what is happening, and if you allow me, I will give some numbers here. You know, if you take the vulnerable countries together, well, the least developed countries, for example, 44 countries, they represent 1.6% of the deficit of the U.S. All of them together, 1.6%. They don't represent anything important in terms of revenue, and they are not a national security issue. So what we say and we call for is spare these countries from the tariffs. But they have received higher tariffs than developed countries. So now they are in the worst position possible. They have higher tariffs than the rest. They have, reprimarization of their economies because trade is what gives them some value added. And now is the value added that is being, damaged. And so these countries will be in the worst possible position. Not receiving investment, haven't been able to go through trade to a better, economy and more diversified economy. And so first, I think that we have to have a voice to say, look at this. It doesn't do anything for your objectives. Yeah. So spare these countries from this impact. And we have to go to the WTO and to the trade regimes to understand that these countries need more flexibility to really be able to diversify and to add value. And the second thing that we should do and help these countries, for example, in Africa, is to have more regional integration, yes? Because regionalism is back, and more regional integration will allow these countries to have economies of scale, more investment, and also be more resilient.
So if regionalism is back, then, and we're thinking about these structures that have existed in the multilateral system that have not necessarily boded terribly well for a lot of developing countries because we are where we are. Mm-hmm. So how are you thinking about that in terms of new multilateralism? What are some of those fundamentals and metrics that really need to be changed, and how we need to not only look at these problems more holistically and differently, but how some of these underpinning structures need to reform to enable it?
That's wonderful. In the trade part, I think that we need to go back to some of the rules that were established in 1995 for a different economy, and we have to be open enough to revise them, because we know that there are some things that have been accumulated as problems. Not everything that the U.S. says is wrong. There are problems that have accumulated during a lot of years, and so we can look at this to reform the WTO norms and rules to make a better playing field for the countries and to allow for this national objective of creating jobs and a diversified economy. That is what everybody wants, yes? But I would say we have always been a voice for reform in WTO. But we need a system. We need rules. We need predictability in the trade system. And I think that that is the value that we have to preserve. Then you have the part of financing, yes? And there we heard in the former panel, we need the multilateral development system, including national development banks, to really crowd in private investment. It won't happen in the vulnerable countries if we don't help de-risking the perception and also the country's risk with respect, for example, the exchange rate risk that they were talking about. So what happened before is that we thought that everything will happen automatically by the invisible hand, yes? You have a lot of private investment, it will go to these countries, or you had domestic resource mobilization, and that will be enough for these countries. And the truth is that according to our research, if you bring multilateral finance with private sector, with government engagement, you can lower the cost of capital between 25 and 40%. So you need some coordination mechanism to crowd in private investment. And obviously, these countries have to do the job. Yes, they have to have the investment facilitation and the policies that are needed. But we know that even when they do all their work and all the homework, they don't make it if the system doesn't respond to their needs. Right now, Africa is getting how much of the foreign direct investment? I guess 2%. 2%. So something is not working, yes? So this coordination and the international system can really help a lot to make this happen.
If some of those reforms were implemented, and understanding that work is going to be obviously quite hard and will take time, but looking ahead to the future and the potential of the result of that, how could that unlock frontier industries across developing economies, across Africa? What is that vision, and what do you foresee that impact to be?
You know, I am optimistic. You know, not very popular these days, but I am.
It's refreshing. It's refreshing.
Because, you know, if you look at the African continent, yes, first of all, the young people will live there. When you go to these countries, you feel this energy, this innovation, this creativity. It's amazing. We have to stop thinking about them only as vulnerable, and you know, we have to think about them in their capacities. The new critical minerals are in Africa. That is a huge possibility for, you know, for the future. And these are much more educated than before, and they have much more capacity than before. So what we need is to remove the obstacles for their development, but they can make it happen. And I think that we are in a moment in which, you know, small changes can get very far to allow these countries to do, you know, to do the right thing for their people.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time. I have to ask, if you had one call to action coming off this stage and in light of this week, being the optimist that you are, what would that be?
I would say the following. We are in a moment that I call an interregnum, yes? We don't know where we will land, but it will depend on us. We have agency. And it depends on what we do, where we will land. Not everything goes in the same direction. So that all goes in the decline. There are many things happening that are really, you know, breakthroughs. So let's use our agency and our voice to help the right and the positive forces for the future to win this battle.
Excellent. Thank you for your optimism and your leadership and for being with us. Thank you.
Please now welcome Caritas Internationalis Secretary General Alistair Dutton and Samaritan's Purse Chief Operating Officer Edward Graham.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Alistair. Hi.
Allison. Allison.
Oh, right.
Allison.
Alistair.
Yes.
You got to pronounce that well. That's right.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure the rose is at the end. So.
Yes. Yes. Amazing. Excellent. There has been some incredible energy on the stage over the last couple hours, and I have no doubt how this started that there will be more. There have been tremendously substantive and important conversations to be had, and I'm absolutely thrilled to join you here on stage to talk about your experience and the way that faith is really connected to foreign assistance. You both have worked directly in and across so many countries that have and are currently experiencing crises and humanitarian conflicts, from Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, around the world. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives to kick off this conversation, how your faith initially led you to this work and how you're seeing that now tie in to the need for foreign assistance and the crisis with respect to foreign assistance that we're seeing right now. Edward, I'd like to start with you, and then Alistair, over to you.
All right. Well, I probably have a very different background than most people that would come into a faith-based organization. And I came from counterterrorism. I spent 20 years in American Special Operations, and just one night I was watching an operation, and in Afghanistan, and it's a house I've been in twice before over the course of the years. And I realize it doesn't end. And I wanted to be part of something that lasts forever. And I believe that the kingdom of Christ lasts forever. And so that's why I left. Now, my father runs Samaritan's Purse, but just because my last name's Graham doesn't mean you run Samaritan's Purse. It's not the way it works. But I felt called to come serve in ministry because I believe there's a different way of doing this. Now, I want great men and women, our armed services, and we do have great men and women serving there. But I believe I had an opportunity and a calling to be a part of something to change the world. And I wanted to change the world. I can't do it personally, but I believe that the Word of God, it says it's sharper than a two-edged sword, and it'll split the divided heart. We're a divided world right now. And so if you want to change the heart of man, I believe it's the gospel. And so that's why I came to Samaritan's Purse, is to love my neighbor.
Thank you for that. It's a great foundation for this conversation. We'll dive into some more of those specifics.
I think you had another question about how foreign policy and it influences that. So, yeah, I think I saw your boss went around. He was wearing a soft power hat.
He was, and he's around here somewhere.
So I had to write a paper on the originator of that term back when I was at West Point. I was an international relations major. I believe what we do is not soft power. But in other ways, you look at it, there's other ways to solve a problem than armed conflict. And when there's a need in the world and a crisis in the world, on organizations like ours, at least I can speak for Samaritan's Purse, we don't really deal with bureaucracy. We can go through red tape, we can cut through areas, and often people think if you go to certain parts of the world that a Christian organization can be there. On our cargo planes, it says helping in Jesus' name when we land. And we've had those cargo planes all over the world. It doesn't matter. We work with governments in order to get in there and meet the immediate needs of those that are suffering. So when it comes to influencing policy, I would always encourage that countries shouldn't be afraid of faith-based organizations and the work they do, because our organizations, I believe, are going to do great quality work and make sure the work is done with very little corruption, as much as possible as you can do in certain countries, but also get the aid to those that are suffering first and immediately without that bureaucracy. So,
thank you for that. And your call out to all of the international relations majors in the world and in the audience.
I think I had a C-, so I'll get your hopes up.
Alistair, over to you, and kind of starting from that premise as well. You know, you had been with the Jesuit refugee service years ago, and that informed the work that you've done over your life. And I'm curious now, as Secretary General of Caritas Internationales, how are you thinking about that integration of your faith and at its roots and the work that you're doing today?
Thanks very much. And I think, like Edward, you know, it begins with a moment of conversion. And I came out of the chemical industry, actually. I'm a physicist and an engineer. And there was one day I was just driving to work and something said, something's got to change. And I railed against it for a couple of years, and then I ended up with the Jesuits, who sent me out to Nepal, and my first experience with refugees from Bhutan in Nepal, and then the whole thing shifted. So I've been 30 years now with Caritas, working in over 60 countries, and it just drives me constantly. And I think one of the main things that drives me is the sheer insatiable human spirit. Wherever I go, however bad the situation is, people just have this huge, huge strength. But to come back to what really drives it, I think, as I was thinking about it this morning, it starts with the words of the Our Father for me. We can say Father, and as a result of God being our Father, we are all made in the image and likeness of God. And from that comes human dignity and infinite worth and inalienable human rights, and that whole body of teaching that the United Nations was created around. And because we can all call God our Father, we are all brothers and sisters. And so we are bound together in one human family, a community of love that has a responsibility to look out for one another and to uphold one another's dignity. And so we can't stand back and do too little, nor should we go too far and do too much. And there's a constant discernment about how do we work with brothers and sisters around the world to really bring that love of God into the midst of them. And I think another thing, you can think of Christ's public life as framed between two statements. He starts his life by going into the synagogue and taking the scroll of Isaiah and say, I came to bring good news for the poor. And so to the international community today, to all of us as brothers and sisters, how are we good news for the poor? And he finishes his public life just as he turns his face towards Jerusalem, and he kind of gives us the performance indicators. He says, when I was hungry, you gave me to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. I was homeless, you sheltered me. And I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And so I think for all of us, that drives us. And we have to remember, 85% of people on the planet today are people of faith. And that's a very Christian articulation of how faith motivates us. But the United Nations, the international system, is founded upon a structure of faith. And it really drives us. And I think one of the things that worries me as I watch the international system, as strained as it is today, is that it doesn't have the faith underpinnings anymore that really support the commitments that were made in the past. So it seems it's weaker because philosophically we don't have that strength underpinning it at the moment.
And there are a number of factors that are clearly strained right now, with a number of geopolitical shifts, rolling back of aid, especially in the humanitarian space, with acute crises all over the world. And I appreciate the point that you made about how Samaritan's Purse and other faith-based organizations and others have a capacity to enter and provide assistance, relief, support, avoiding or navigating what are otherwise more bureaucratic, slow-moving systems. And so in this need and time of urgency, I really appreciate that. And when you're talking about brothers and sisters and not being afraid of faith-based organizations, I'm curious then how you can sort of operationalize, for lack of a better characterization, that and partnerships with governments, with civil society organizations and others to ensure that the capacity that you have from a funding perspective is leveraged in partnership with those organizations that are on the ground.
Well, for us, our partners usually on the ground, we always try to work through the local church. Samaritan's Purse may be registered there as an entity, and with the government, especially during a crisis or disaster, we'll have to seek registration for importation reasons. But at some point, Samaritan's Purse plans on leaving. But what does that local church look like that is there? And so our programming and the work we do is through that local church. Or if areas that do not have a church and countries that do not, we work through local partners and equipping them to do the work and to make it sustainable. So yes, usually if it's an emergency or crisis, there's an emergency disaster relief, we got to get it there quickly and work aid. So we'll have staff that goes there and trains and equips the locals, the local capacity in the local church. But I want us to leave, and I want that church more established and better. I want it flourishing. I want there to be life and celebrating life after we leave. And so I don't want Samaritan's Purse getting the credit. I want the church getting the credit. God gets the credit in the work that we do. So our program might be a little different. Also, Samaritan's Purse, we don't run off grants. My dad had a rule a long time ago, then less than about 10 to 13% of total contributions coming in could be from a grant. So most of our grants would be food from, like, say, the World Food Program to support ongoing feeding operations. Ours comes from the charitable giving of the church. I call it the widow's mite, from the story from Scripture. So if we lose the trust of the widow, we don't exist anymore. And I believe that she gives expecting us to do great quality work. So it's important with our partners that when we do come, we're bringing our very best and we're giving our very best. But for us, it's not Samaritan's Purse. It is about those local partners that you're talking about and leaving that capability and stability there. It is theirs to take and use and run.
Thank you for that. And that speaks very much to this question about sustainability and what does that really mean and what does that really look like? Alistair, from you and from Caritas' perspective, how are you engaging with partners, also making sure that you're understanding what the needs are at a local level, and also enabling those local organizations to really guide those efforts, and so that it enables you to move on and provide your support elsewhere?
Thank you. For Caritas, it's not really a question of partners per se, because Caritas is a global confederation of 165 national church organizations. So Caritas Nigeria, Caritas Ethiopia, Caritas Sri Lanka, Caritas Myanmar, and all of those are the local church. It's a completely local entity that is a body of the National Bishops' Conference and the church present in the region. So it's always a question for us of how globally do we coordinate, do we animate, how do we bring resources from outside, but it's always within the leadership and guidance of the local church, and that's very much the model for us. So it's not a model of us going in, it is a model of the local capacity and the strength of the local people and the local church, and really investing in that. And how do they need support? What do they need? If we need to scale up, do they need extra capacity? But it's always the local church that leads and drives. And I think that's absolutely fundamental to the dignity of local people.
Can you share a few examples of how that's working in practice?
Sure. So one springs to mind when the Nepal earthquake happened, and we're just on the 10th anniversary of that. As soon as I got the news, an old friend of mine was then the chief executive, or the priest in charge of Caritas Nepal, and I immediately WhatsApped him, and he said, I'm in the marketplace now, we're trying to find blankets, and they were pulling the rubble and the dust off the shops, trying to get the blankets out so they could get them out to the people, and others from Caritas were already out and talking. So within half an hour of the earthquake, the local church was already mobilising. And then Caritas members around the world immediately were launching appeals, raising the resources and talking with Caritas Nepal to say, what do you see, what's needed, what's the programme you can put together, how best can we help? And so it was very much a local effort within half an hour, and then the resources come in and support that. And then we went on to do great things over the last 10 years.
Excellent. Thank you. These examples are really helpful to understand how this is working in practice, and also how your organizations operate, what can be learned from, and how that can inform other similar efforts around the world. So I appreciate that. In the world that we're living as well, with limited and constrained resources, we need to crowd in, right? Crowd in funding, crowd in investment, crowd in support, as much as we can for a common objective. And so for both of your organizations, how are you thinking about that, and how are you operating in practice in ways that are transcending, religion or cultural differences or others, to work collaboratively with all organizations to make sure that you're galvanizing the broad-based resources that are needed for the challenge that's at hand? Edward, over to you, and then Alistair.
Well, for us, for Samaritan's Purse, we get our name from the name and the story, the scripture of the Good Samaritan. So in that story, there was a man that was beaten and broken and left in the ditch. And we know about a man that came along after two other religious leaders should have stopped. They didn't. They passed this man. A man that shouldn't have stopped did, and he met immediate needs. And that's what Samaritan's Purse does. Food, water, transportation, those are all things that Samaritan's Purse can provide, medical aid. But he also provided housing and shelter. We do that too. But there was a debt paid to the innkeeper. I believe that debt to be the blood of Jesus Christ. It is why we go and what we do. So when it comes to funding, sourcing, crowding resources to bring what is needed to, we will work with partners. But what we won't do is compromise our work and the quality of our work, or an agenda that is not in line with the mission of Samaritan's Purse. And that's to meet the immediate suffering of the world in the name of Jesus Christ, and to do that so boldly. So again, I've mentioned we are funded primarily by the Widow's Mite, by donations, and these are $10 gifts. These aren't large grants. Sometimes we do, but this is maybe a lady, and this is all she can give. She gives us her money. Now, over time, we have acquired hospitals, planes, aircraft that allows us to go and respond quickly. Often we have resources that other organizations do not have, or we've been fortunately blessed with government relations other smaller organizations may not have. We do, I talked about working through church partners. We have other partners, Christian NGOs, faith-based NGOs that we'll work with. If they're in that area and already have great capacity, and if something's not broke, don't fix it. You work through them and you give them the resources and equip and acquire. So I can remember when Samaritan's Purse was 5 people size, now to what it is. Other organizations need help and capacity that God's entrusted to us. It is theirs to use. So when I go into our warehouses and I look at our hospitals on the shelves, they're not ours. They're the Lord's to use and to give free. All those are given away. Even when Samaritan's Purse goes to, say we go to Turkey after the earthquake and we set up a hospital there, when we leave, the hospital is gifted to the Ministry of Health. It is theirs. We train their hospital how to use it. And so that happens almost every deployment. So it's not a hospital we're taking back, it is a hospital we're giving. So every resource, everything we have is for the world, for the church to use for His glory. So that's how we give our resources away. But as far as it comes and working and coordinating efforts, I got to be honest, we are very selective because we're very concerned about who we let in that may jeopardize the quality of the good work.
Alistair, how are you thinking about that? And how are you working to really broaden the support and the resources that are available and collaborating with other organizations that may be of, a different faith or a different organization, different culture, et cetera?
Thanks. I think the first thing to recognise and celebrate is that people of faith are disproportionately generous towards this area of work. I think it is fundamental to all of the major world religions, and particularly Christianity, just because I know it best. And so within the churches, people are immensely generous. As Edward says, it can be donations of $10, but they all add up, and people are really leaning in. And so as we talk about the aid cuts that we're facing at the moment, we're turning to people in the churches and saying, we have to keep this work going. This is fundamental to what it is to be the church, and people are responding generously. But we have to look and finding new sources of funding. We have to try and access whatever we can so that we can do as much as we possibly can. And as people become more sceptical, my message is, if you think the system is flawed, for sure it is, but lean in and make it better. Don't pull it apart. So when I hear some of the things about how international law, foreign policy saying the era of development is over, development's dead, it isn't. No. It really isn't. And that messages like that will only increase scepticism. We have to say it isn't over, we need to get in, and we need to do a lot more. And in terms of working with others that aren't Christian or aren't of the faith, that's irrelevant to us. We work together with all faiths and none. And I have said that when I was responding on the front line to major emergencies, I probably spent 35% of my time in meetings with other agencies saying, how can we work better together? How can we cooperate more? How can we make sure that we're complementing one another? We're making it stronger. We're not leaving gaps. We can go in and fill it. And that is absolutely fundamental to the way the system works. And I would say the best examples where we have done the highest quality work is when resources have been scarcest, because necessity is the mother of invention.
Yes. What he just said, where there's little resources, I call it God room. I didn't coin that phrase. A guy by the name of Bob Pierce, who started World Vision and also Samaritan's Purse, talked about God room. Planned so big and so boldly it would surely fail. So if you're an organization that I don't have the resources, that's not the time to not or do inaction. And we look at right now, we're talking about the USAID going away. I know a lot of that's for a lot of organizations, they have struggled to get the funds needed. My encouragement to that is look at a funding source that is not based off the U.S. taxpayer. You should be getting the support of your church to get behind of what you're doing. The church should be. So this is a time for the church around the world to step up when there's a lack of resources.
Can I just build on that very briefly? Because and it's to go to the Gospel of John and the feeding of the 5,000. Because you start with a little boy who comes forward with 5 loaves and 3 fish. And they not only feed 5,000, the baskets fill, the crumbs, the leftovers fill 12 baskets. The 12 baskets are the 12 tribes of Israel. That is the promise to the world. So we will see 100-fold, but we have to keep investing in exactly that way, and we'll see it grow.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments, and with respect to the end of development, I think it's not so much a declaration, but rather a provocation. And also, if you dig into those pages, you'll read that there is reform that is needed.
But you
systems are not.
Me, so I responded.
Yes,
that's what you wanted.
Exactly, because that's precisely what we need. Are those ideas of how can systems that are not working the way they were intended, how can they be reformed, and how can that be done collaboratively and urgently. And so leaning in, as you very importantly put, is absolutely necessary, and it's necessary by all of us, wherever we sit, in whatever organizations we work for and who we work with. And I appreciate that spirit of collaboration and thinking through what is the need, who is asking for it, rather than determining or selecting who may need it. But thinking about things differently and thinking about, we're working on a project, Global Governance Reimagined. What does that look like? And many of the conversations that we've had today on this stage and around the room and around New York and elsewhere is things need to change, and that is absolutely clear. How can we really prioritize with the limited resources that we have to drive the impact that we all hope to see? And so I appreciate both of your work, your organizations, your teams, and the efforts around the world, and your willingness and openness to lean in, because it's a collective challenge for all of us. Thank you for being here today and for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage American Jewish World Service President and CEO, Robert Bank, for a conversation with journalist Stacey Samuel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for bringing all of your energy, this late in the afternoon and in the week. We know that inequality is growing. We've been hearing how human rights funding is spiraling, and old development models just have lost ground. It's the faith-based and values-driven organizations that we've been hearing about that are filling that critical gap. And organizations like the American Jewish World Service are embodying the ideals of solidarity, empowerment, and the belief that every person deserves the opportunity to realize their full rights and potential. American Jewish World Service is the leading Jewish organization advancing human rights and ending poverty across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So I'm so happy to have this conversation with you, Robert. You're a lifelong human rights lawyer and activist. You've really made your career in ensuring dignity, justice for women, LGBTQI plus people, immigrants, and marginalized communities. Now, there's no question in that. I just wanted people to know that, because you have really dedicated your professional and personal life to the work that you're doing. When you introduce AJWS, you often emphasize that although you are a Jewish organization, your mission is to fund and stand with communities that are not Jewish. Mm-hmm. Why is that principle of funding the other so central to your work, and what does it signal in today's global climate?
Well, first of all, thank you, Stacey. It's wonderful to have met you as part of this wonderful FP event.
Likewise.
And it's beautiful to look out at this audience and see many AJWS supporters. So that's wonderful, because, we are what we are because of the incredible philanthropists who support our organization, who are so invested in the social movements we support around the world. To your question about our values, we were founded 40 years ago. This is our 40th year. We're a millennial, and we are, we're very in tune. Yes. And what we believed in our founders were people who believed in this idea of the combination between the Jewish value of what we call B'Tselem Elohim, which means that everyone is born equal in dignity and rights. And a lot of people here might recognize that is the first line of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yes. So that sort of fusion of our Jewish tradition and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is really the founding principle of American Jewish World Service. And the idea was to give, in 1985, American Jews and anyone else who would want to join American Jews the opportunity to be involved in supporting some of the most persecuted and oppressed people in the world, none of whom are Jewish, and who are living in some of the most complicated contexts. And we have really succeeded in doing that to this day, and it's a very humbling and beautiful, beautiful part of our value system.
And that really sets the stage for some of the stories that you've shared about working with youth movements, supporting, like in Senegal, supporting the rights of girls, adolescents in places like India. What do those examples teach us about the role of faith-based philanthropy in creating safe spaces and supporting grassroots leadership for change, as your organization does?
Well, I think those are two great examples, so thank you for raising them. One of the most important things about how we do our work is that we actually believe that local people have the solutions to their own problems. So we're not a top-down funder, right? We believe that the answers are there. We are a grassroots funder, but we also believe the grassroots needs some help. And so we invest in grassroots leaders, not only financially, that's certainly one part of our model, but the other part of our model is that we invest in grassroots groups by providing them with what the great Paul Farmer used to call reverent listening, right? We call it accompaniment, solidarity, being there for activists and great leaders who are building their own communities. So that's sort of one part of our philosophy. Another part of our philosophy is that we believe in funding a constellation of grantees. So every year we fund over 500 social justice organizations around the world. Over the past 40 years, we have funded thousands of organizations that have built movements over time. An example of that is the youth movement in Senegal.
Yes.
We were the first funder, or one of the first funders, of an organization called Yenamar. Yenamar in French means we're fed up. This was a group of journalists, rappers, photographers, artists who decided they were going to speak out against, at that time, President Abdullah Wade, because he was overstaying his constitutional term in government. And they organized hundreds of thousands of young people to educate themselves about that this was unconstitutional. They came to the polls, and Yenamar, this incredible group, has been credited with actually allowing the democracy process to proceed in Senegal. And I will tell you that a great, great leader by the name of Alou Sané was someone who really came to the fore in the last presidential election in Senegal, because Yenamar again came back, because guess what? 10 years later, the next president also wanted to extend the constitutional term and succeeded in that not happening this time as well. So we're very, very proud. And we now have President Faye as one of the youngest African presidents on the continent.
Indeed.
And this is really due to the investment by HWS and other funders.
You know, and I'm glad you mentioned we were talking about funding youth movements, because it is rather in a volatile political and funding environment, these are politically sensitive topics, but it doesn't seem like you shy away from them. In fact, it seems like you lean into them, because AJWS also funds a lot of human rights issues and reproductive rights issues, and supports the LGBTQI plus communities in countries around the world that aren't necessarily progressive yet. What does what does that look like, and why step in that?
Well, listen, I think all faith-based groups have a sort of complexity of people, a wide variety of people in that faith-based group, right? There are some who are more conservative and some who are more progressive, and everything in between. The American Jewish World Service philosophy is that everyone is equal in dignity and rights. And that means every human being, whether that is a person who is queer in Kenya. We fund the human rights of sex workers. We believe that everyone has the right to organize themselves, to improve their lives, and to thrive. So, for example, with respect to homosexuality, we are one of the largest American funders of LGBTQ people around the world and their human rights, because we believe that this is one of the most oppressed and persecuted groups of people.
Yes, we know this.
And we are very, very proud of the people of Thailand, who, after many, many years of organizing, managed to become the first country in Southeast Asia last year to legalize same-sex marriage. And it was AJWS grantees that helped draft that bill. So We understand that there are different points of view amongst faith-based groups around issues like reproductive health and homosexuality, and many, many other issues. But essentially, we just go down to the golden rule, right? The golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
It's that simple, and that's a mission that is hard to dispute, whatever faith one may belong to, or none at all, for that matter.
Exactly.
Right? We don't have much time, but I wanted to ask, in this moment of global uncertainty, what is your call to action to other philanthropists and faith-based actors like AJWS?
Listen, we're living in one of the most extraordinary times in history. Extraordinary attacks on human rights, extraordinary attacks on international development, on foreign aid and humanitarian assistance. And what we need to do is believe that we can make a change regardless. And I have so much confidence in the goodness in people. And the people that support AJWS, that is an ever-growing and expanding group of people. Gosh, you started with youth. And there's a whole next generation, right, that is so exposed to what it means to treat everyone with dignity around the world, in this country and around the world. So my clarion call is get involved with organizations that are doing work that is truly respectful of the people that they are serving. And change will happen.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership. And in a very short time, you made it very clear what can be done and what we should be doing. Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Stacey.
And now, please welcome to the stage Bangladeshi Special Envoy of the Head of the Interim Government, Lutfi Siddiqui, for a conversation with FP's Andrew Solinger.
Congratulations, everyone. You've made it to the final discussion of FP at UNGA and the power of purpose. The discussion that we're going to have today, I'm actually super excited about this convo that we're about to have with Lutfi Siddiqui, Special Envoy to the Head of the Interim Government, Chief Advisor's Office, Bangladesh. Long title, but very interesting one, a little amorphous. And it would be fantastic, Lutfi, if you would tell us exactly what that means and to set the table for us to remind everyone of the recent history of Bangladesh in particular. Because 1 year ago, a little more than a year ago, Sheikh Hasina, who had been in rule for over 10 years, 15 years, something close to that, was overthrown by a popular movement, and now a brilliant move to democracy, long overdue. And you're part of the follow-up restructuring there. Please tell us a little bit about your role in the situation in Bangladesh.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for staying on for this session. Just a bit of context about Bangladesh. There are 135 other countries that have higher per capita GDP than us. There are about 95 other countries that have greater landmass than us, but there are only 7 countries in the world that have a greater number of people than we do, and only 2 of those 7 have a population that's younger than us. So when you put it all together, you have a very large number of young people crammed together in the world's most densely populated country, apart from city-states. The next most densely populated country has half the density of we do. So that is the context that we're in. And so when you try to gaslight people who are in those conditions and you fail to deliver on their economic aspirations, it is a tinderbox. And particularly when they're digitally connected, young people digitally connected, they know enough to hold big dreams, but they also know that they're not empowered enough to realize them. And so we had the gift of an uprising just over a year ago last year, a tragic 36-day period where, according to the UN, at least 1,400 young people were killed, many, many more injured. I noticed that you have the power of purpose as one of your headlines today. I have to tell you, I've never felt so viscerally about the purpose of what I'm doing right now. So we had a vacuum. There was we needed a government. We are extremely fortunate that Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Professor Muhammad Yunus, assumed responsibility as head of the interim government. He invited a few people to join him. I was one of them. We've given ourselves what will end up becoming an 18-month period, so we will have elections in February of next year, by which time we will hand over power to an elected government. But extremely important that between now and then we engage in a series of reforms, multifaceted, multidimensional, system-wide reforms, governance reforms, so that we don't end up in a situation where someone can be elected seemingly democratically and then turn autocrat because there aren't enough checks and balances within the system and ultimately fail to deliver on the aspirations of people.
So thank you for explaining that. And it is wonderful that Muhammad Yunus, Nobel Peace Prize winner, is now helming this, and his title is Special Advisor. He's not even
Chief Advisor.
Chief Advisor.
Yes.
He's not even taking on a title that indicates an intention to stay in power. Right. Your role, tell us a little bit about specifically what you do with the government and with the Chief Advisor.
Right. So if you imagine the context in which I flew into the country, it was less than a month since the fall of the previous regime, and it was all hands on deck. So it's a matter of where can you put out fires, where, and get things going. So my title is I'm Special Envoy for International Affairs. I have a cabinet equivalent rank. And I engage in two things. One is economic diplomacy, so the rest of the world, lots of questions, what's going on in the world of aid, in the world of finance, public sector, multilateral development banks, private sector. And the other is I perform a bit of a coordinating role. I'm the coordinating minister cutting across vertical ministries to get things done.
Thank you for explaining. And tell us a little bit about this change in power was really driven from a youth movement. You mentioned it's a very young country.
Yes.
And we seem to be in the midst of a chain of youth movements that are taking place across the world. This is Gen Z-driven, socially driven change that doesn't really have a leader. It happens from the ground up. I don't know that I would go back and authoritatively say Bangladesh was the first, but it certainly, of the most recent trend, was the first and of a dramatic move. And since then, we've had Nepal with a change in government and also violence. There's been similar unrest in Kenya, in Sri Lanka. Would you say that the world and these movements in these countries and youth are looking towards what you're building out, not to put too much more on your shoulders than you've already got?
So, yes, the short answer is I think so. But also, just to emphasize what you just said, it shows what I started off by saying, that you can't BS young people anymore, right? They know exactly what's going on. You can't bamboozle them. You can't lie to them. And the way they ended up with the result of the previous government running away, distributed leadership, I'm sure that's a movie in the making to begin with. And Professor Yunus's, one of the amazing things he did is two of those student leaders are in cabinet running ministries right now. They're in their 20s. And that is in itself a demonstration of how we believe that they have more answers than we do. In terms of lessons that this particular story might hold for others, yes, the uprising is half the story, and there are other parts of the world where you've had that rupture. I think what's very important is what happens afterwards, and we've taken, first of all, accident of history, very positive that we have Nobel Peace Laureate Professor Yunus at the helm, because you really needed someone who could rise above the social frictions and the fractures to be able to hold command at this stage. But also, we've taken a fairly, maybe I should say, geeky way of approaching reforms. So we know we need reforms in the judiciary, in the parliamentary system. Do we need an upper house or a lower house? The way the civil service runs, anti-corruption bureau. So there are 11 of those. One of which is a Women's Affairs Reforms Commission. So he wants us to take a gender lens through the other reform commissions. We have a labour reform commissions to make sure that labour standards are upgraded once and for all. They were given 90 days each. They came back with recommendations. They're all in reports. They're available on a website. Now we're going through a consensus building process. Political parties in the room. Can you all sign up to a base set of reforms that you all believe in? And that will be finalized within the next few weeks, and then you go into elections. So that is the structural, methodical way in which we're trying to do this. Now, change doesn't happen overnight, and in all likelihoods, there will be a relapse in many of the changes that we're trying to make. So you need a theory of change. How do you make change happen? And so there's reforms at a grand level. Everything I just described to you is pretty much highfalutin stuff. But the man or woman on the street need to see the benefit of reforms on a daily basis. I call it retail reforms. So how long does it take you to get your passport, your land registered? If you're a business person, your cargo going through the ports, the ease with which you're using the logistics of the country, customs, tax, getting a birth certificate, all of those things where there is rampant corruption at the retail level. Can we demonstrate sufficient change in the day-to-day, monitor them, make sure they stick, so that you create an element of addiction amongst people for more? I want more reforms so that a political government is compelled to respond to that. That's the theory of change. Wish us luck, because we'll need a lot of that for that theory to be in practice.
Let's wish him luck. Good luck. So retail reform, I like that very much. Some here in some circles call that government efficiency, of course. But that is incredibly important to be able to show people that change and the value of that change. I want to turn to development for a moment, because we could talk for so much longer than the time that we have, and everyone's already ready to network. Tell us a little bit about your interfaces with some of these multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the IMF, commercial partners, other aid organizations. You've given us some of the economic dynamics of Bangladesh. There's many different programs that work with Bangladesh. What are those discussions like? What are they, when in this time of crisis, when we have conflict and competition all over the world, protectionism, everyone's got debt crises. The last thing I would imagine they want to hear is, oh, great, Bangladesh. Now we've got to think about, what to do with this lending program. What are you hearing? What are they telling you?
You've got to look at the facts. The facts are that we have arrested what was a decline in the value of our currency, a pretty steep plummeting, which has now been turned around, mainly because we've had a record amount of remittances from overseas workers. Remittances up some 30% year on year, and it seems to be persisting. Reserves that had halved over a year's time, and that is now on the uptick. A record amount of funds committed and disbursed by the likes of the World Bank, the IMF, but also the ADB, the Asia Development Bank. One main reason is that our reform agenda and the reforms that all of these organizations talk about, there is a perfect coincidence in that. There is a political will to enact the same reforms now. And in many ways, if we talk about the Trump tariffs, for example, like Bangladesh, initially we were slapped with a 37% tariff. It's down to 20%. And at least one of the reasons is that many of the reforms, many of the removal of non-tariff barriers that want us to get rid of, they're perfectly consistent with what we need to do for our own businesses anyway. So, of course, the closure of USAID has had some impact with the Rohingya refugees, for example. It's going to be impacted significantly. We have had organizations like we have a medical research team that have come up with cost-effective medication for diarrhea, that sort of stuff, which has been then saving lives right from the world. They had to be shut down because of that. But I think we are in a new world order where it's more trade, not aid. And I think no one's going to give us a free pass for being poor anymore. There's no such thing as non-reciprocal freebies anymore.
Yes,
so we're pulling up our socks and getting ready for that.
And there's an element of that discussion that we've had all day long around the need for countries to be more focused on what they can possibly do themselves. Yes. And there are something like 13 million Bangladeshis who live outside of the country, a huge expat community, much more than that probably. So that's wonderful to hear. We are foreign policy, of course. I wanted to take a tick to talk about geopolitics. You kind of brought it up with tariffs. You're in an interesting geopolitical, geographic zone as well. well. There's been a lot of interplay between the U.S. and India. A knock on U.S. administrations, not just the current one, is that they look at Bangladesh through an Indian lens, larger neighbor. Yet you sit on the border with China and have relationships with China. What's your posture? What is the transitional government's posture on relationships between China and the U.S. in terms of the position that Bangladesh plays? There are pushes for alliances with both.
So that framing and that narrative hasn't really, I haven't found it very useful, because for us it's a false binary. We had a summit between Professor Yunus, our leader, with the Chinese president, and we've had a good amount of Chinese investments in the country in the last few months. On the day that summit took place, we inaugurated Starlink in the country. And you wouldn't, if you looked at the world through that geopolitical lens, you wouldn't be able to square those two. We then moved on to Japan for the next summit, and we're about to close a free trade agreement with Japan. It'll be our first major economic partnership agreement with any major economy. Further west, we are inviting DP World to invest in our port down south, and we've also started free trade agreement negotiations with them. So we're going further west and further east, Southeast Asia, ASEAN. We were in Malaysia recently, and we will become a sectoral dialogue partner with ASEAN. So it's really, geopolitics is now plurilateral. You're part of multiple different clubs, and if you don't want to be part of this club, I'll meet you at the other one. And we certainly want to be in any and every club as possible. If you have issues with other countries, come to Dhaka. We'll help you resolve those.
Wonderful. Plurilateralism, I've come up with, if I could say it, I've come up with a variety of new terms here, retail reform as well. Lefty Siddiqui, it's fantastic to hear, first of all, the change, which was a tragic outcome ultimately for Sheikh Hasina leaving, but now seemingly a great strides made, improvements in Bangladesh. Thank you for being part of it and for sharing your story with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Please join me in welcoming and thanking Siddiqui. Thank you very much. I'm going to close now. So if you Okay, everyone, I promise where you can hear everyone in the next room, so I'll be very brief. I just want to make some closing remarks and talk about a couple of points on the conversations that we've had today. First of all, I think you will agree it's very interesting in this time of pressure on development aid, different faith-based organizations coming together to work on a lot of the same issues. We didn't necessarily have them all on stage at the same time, but you heard those different perspectives. It's hard to coordinate that, and I congratulate them for telling their stories and sharing their stories from their perspectives. And honestly, when you hear it, it's all saying the same thing. It's helping on humanitarian issues, helping those that need that help. And it gives me hope and encouragement that we will be able to get out of this fiscal mess, which we also talked about when we were discussing debt reform and horrible migrant situations and slavery that need addressing as well. So I was very, very encouraged by that. And I think that we do present somewhat of a united front on protecting human rights and trying to collaborate. So I want to say thanks again to those organizations, American Jewish World Service, Claritas Internationalis, Catholic Relief Services, the Global Donors Forum, IOM, the UN Migration Agency, and Open Society Foundations. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. I want to welcome you to join us and look at future events that we might do at Foreign Policy. This is our last program here at UNGA, but if you go to foreignpolicy.com/events, you'll see more of our programming. And the next one coming up is at the World Health Summit in Berlin. And then you have COP after that, and we will likely be at the Summit of the Americas in the Dominican as well. Lastly, and I promise this is really the last bit before I let you go, I wanted to speak to my FP teammates, only a few of whom are in the room, but just to tell you a little bit about what has happened in this room and in this space in the past week. I'm incredibly proud of all the programming we produced this week. 8 forums. We did our gender program, Her Power, on Monday. Energy and climate on Tuesday morning, and tech and AI on Tuesday afternoon. We did 3 separate health programs yesterday, and development just now. 2 public briefings, one on climate health yesterday and this morning on resilience governance, 8 private roundtables on a variety of topics, and countless high-level bilats. We've had 4 fun receptions And the 5th you're about to join as soon as I shut up. But I wanted to give you a wacky tally. That's 10 public events with 60 sessions, 124 speakers, 29 partners, and 8 roundtables with 124 participants. That is insane. I could not be prouder. And this all sounds like a rah-rah team speech, but I wanted to, and of course I would say these convenings spread understanding and knowledge and all that sort of stuff, change, growth, sustainability, resilience, and democracy. But when I asked the amazing Toko Elfik-Puli of Gates Foundation yesterday how we could help her work in Africa saving lives, she explained to me that we already are. Spreading the word of your important work helps to save lives. So this work matters. I hope you're as proud of it as I am. So when you have a cocktail, raise a glass to the FP team. Thank you.